the brand new Jato 4x4 VXL. And today we're gonna find out if I was wrong or if I was right about the latest basher from Traxxas. The very first thing I noticed is just how light this thing is. As you can see, this thing tips the scales at 5 pounds 11 ounces, and that's about the same weight as the 3S Arrma Typhon. The VXL version of the Jato has a lot of similarities to the BL2S version, but there's a lot of differences, and today we're gonna find out all of them. First of all, I have to say, I think this body looks really, really good. This is one of the nicest buggy bodies I've ever seen, though I'm a little bit concerned about what kind of batteries we're gonna be able to fit under this body. Taking that body off is as easy as removing these 4 clips, and with that body off, we can see there's no cage or anything under the body. We do have the clips to hold it on, but other than that, it's just a pretty standard Lexan body, and it feels medium thick, though again, it is really, really pretty. Underneath that body, things are very different from the BL2S version of the Jato, and we've got a lot to go over here. First of all, on the aluminum 17mm hubs, we have bespoke wheels and tires. These wheels and tires actually make me a little bit nervous though, because as you can see, they don't appear to have a standard buggy offset. These are standard buggy wheels, and in comparison, you can see the offsets quite a bit deeper on these Traxxas wheels, which means they're getting a bit of the width of the buggy from these wheels and tires themselves. And whereas at 305mm, this is a standard buggy width, if you put standard buggy tires on it, it ends up quite a bit more narrow. I'm really not a huge fan of RC car manufacturers making up for the narrow width of their arms with wider tires, simply because that locks you into their tires to keep that width. Now, speaking of these tires, these do feel pretty good. They have what I would consider a medium compound. The rubber feels high quality. As you can see, these wheels are vented, but the tires aren't. And overall, these feel like they're gonna be fairly competent tires, but we're gonna have to find out when we bash it. Connecting those tires to the buggy are these unique 17mm hexes. Again, you can see these are extended out a little bit as well, which means we're making up even more for these shorter arms. What definitely isn't short or small is this wing. This is the same wing that's on the Traxxas Sledge, and on this Jato, it kind of seems too big to me. Of course, for aerodynamic stability and downforce when racing, that might actually be a good thing, but I'm not really convinced this thing's designed for racing, even though these tires and wheels do look like racing tires and wheels. I'm definitely going to be curious to see what you think about this design once we get done looking at all the details, and I'll be interested to see what you have to say down in the comments as to whether or not you think this thing's going to be a basher or a racer. Speaking of this thing being a basher, if there's one thing I love to do, it's turning a buggy into a truggy, so we're going to be putting these bigger wheels on it later in the video. That should be really interesting. With those tires off, we get our first look at the suspension, and this is the new heavy-duty suspension Traxxas has been putting on all their new 3S platform vehicles. It's significantly beefed up from their old style in both the front and in the rear. To take a closer look at it, we're going to have to get these wheel hexes off, and these are held on a little bit differently than I'm used to seeing. They've got an internal nut here, kind of like some of the aftermarket 17mm hexes have. Taking a closer look at that internal nut, it is a pretty interesting design. I'm not really sure why it's been chopped down here in the middle, though maybe it's just for weight reduction. That does allow us to pull off these 17mm hexes, and as you can see, these are definitely unique to this vehicle. And I have had people ask me why Traxxas 17mm hexes are shaped like this. Ostensibly, it's for better grip on the wheel. This castellated shape gives more places for the hex to grip onto the wheel and should help prevent rounding out. Underneath that 17mm hex, we have what looks like a pretty standard 1/10 scale style stub axle and a relatively anemic looking cross pin transferring the power to that hex. This makes me a little bit nervous for putting those bigger tires on. And under here, I'm a little disappointed to find one of these threaded pins. These do tend to back out, and they're also not the strongest in the world and don't feel very premium. Pulling this knuckle off, we see we do have a shim here. This helps reduce play in the wheel. And then removing this stub axle, we can see we do have sealed bearings on the inside and the outside, and this inside bearing does look pretty nice. The steering is a little bit stiff, but that'll probably wear in, and these parts do look pretty beefy. Putting that power down are axles that look almost identical to Traxxas Max axles. These do a pretty good job on the fairly heavy Max and should be fine for this car, though if you decide to go 5 or 6S, it might not be enough. Behind that is where things start to get a little bit confusing because we've got non-adjustable links here. And whereas there is some adjustment on the shock tower that we'll look at in a minute, for this being the higher end, seemingly race-oriented vehicle, having non-adjustable links is a little bit strange. That being said, as a basher, I actually appreciate these non-adjustable links. Having plastic all the way through, as long as that plastic is well made, and Traxxas plastic usually is well made, can actually be quite a bit stronger than having adjustable links. The adjustable link compromises strength in order to have that adjustability, and this solid plastic link probably isn't going to be breaking anytime soon. Of course, you can't adjust it. One thing I do like to see is that everything appears to be mounted in double shear. If you're not familiar with that term, basically it just means that the link is supported on both sides sides. If it was mounted like this and just had a screw going through like that, that would be known as single shear, and that's significantly weaker than double shear, and I expect to see double shear on any higher end basher these days, and this has it. Moving around to the front, we do have GTR shocks, but these aren't quite as nice as the GTR shocks I'm used to seeing. Whereas these shocks do have really nice looking aluminum bodies and they do have positively retained lower spring perches, we're missing something that I really like to see on GTR shocks, and one of the things that usually makes them really special. That special feature that we're missing is the titanium nitride coated shock shafts. That's not that big of a deal. The titanium nitriding doesn't actually make them any stronger, but it does provide a really hard, slippery coating on here that not only looks nice, but improves initial stiction and reduces scratching. Popping the plastic top off of this, we can see we do have a bladder style shock here. There's nothing really wrong with that, but most modern bashers are going to emulsion style shocks. Those emulsion style shocks tend to have a little bit less internal rebound, so they handle jump landing better. How well these will handle jump landing, we're just gonna have to find out. One thing I am happy to not see are progressive springs. Traxxas was putting progressive springs on their shocks for a while, and they were some of the worst springs you could get. These are just standard linear rate springs, and they feel pretty good. This Jato-specific front shock tower is a pretty interesting design. It's held in with 4 screws and does have quite a bit of adjustability, but seems kind of flimsy for the exposed location that it's in, especially if this is designed as a basher. Front shock absorption's handled by this little upper bumper and this little lower bumper. The front module comes off as one piece, and coming out behind that is an aluminum center drive shaft. The BL2S version only gives you a plastic one. Speaking of plastic, oh boy, this servo. We'll take a look at that in a minute. We do get aluminum A and D blocks, but the B and C blocks are cast right into the chassis, so they're gonna be plastic. Pulling these covers off, we get our first look at the front differential. As you can see, this is definitely greased with some really nasty stuff. You wanna be careful with this because if you get it on yourself, you're gonna get it on something else, then you're gonna be in trouble. That being said, these are the same standard 1/10 scale differentials we've seen in a million different vehicles, so they are a little bit nicer than the ones you get in the Minimax. I did hear a rumor that they're gonna be updating the Minimax and re-releasing it with these differentials, which is smart because the few cents they saved on the other differentials probably wasn't worth all the bad publicity they caused. We do have some nice stout sealed bearings here. And behind this sintered steel ring gear, we do have internal bevel gears. You can see we do have a silicone gasket here, which is really nice to see. This is a sealed differential, but we do only have 2 spider gears in here, which is weaker than a 4-gear setup. Overall, these differentials should be adequate and they feel reasonably smooth. One place I can say this Jato is definitely superior to at least the 3S Arrma cars is in the servo saver. This is a very decent servo saver, but what isn't superior is this servo. And to take a closer look at that, we first need to take a look at this unique radio box. While the design of this is very familiar to anybody who's had a Traxxas before, this specific box I believe is unique to the Jato vehicles, and unlike the BL2S, you do get a TQI in here, which means you're going to get that Traxxas stability management. Unfortunately, that TSM really isn't the advantage that it used to be, because these days a lot of RTR cars come with a gyro, and a lot of those gyros are running servos that are far superior to what we're going to find here. I will say, as recently as just a few years ago, this probably would have been an acceptable servo, as most manufacturers, especially in their lower end cars, weren't really supplying really nice servos. Fortunately for you guys, but unfortunately for Traxxas, that's kind of changed. And these days, the era of the throwaway servo is mostly over. As you can see here, this servo is fully waterproof. It does have O-rings on the screws, but that's not really what we're interested in. What we came for is to bask in the glory of a completely plastic gear set. Now, these are decent plastic gears, and this 2075 servo probably won't strip right away, but chances are it is going to strip eventually. And I'm not trying to be hard on Traxxas here, but plastic gears in a car, especially a car this expensive, is kind of inexcusable these days. It's not like this is an older carryover vehicle. They could have put a better servo in this. I could even understand keeping this servo in the BL2S version and putting a better servo in this version, which costs quite a bit more. But you know what? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this thing will hold up just fine. We're only going to know once we bash it. Rounding out the 2075 servo and the TQI receiver, we have a brand new VXL 4S ESC. I'm not sure if this is the same old ESC, just in a new case, but this case is significantly smaller than the old one was. And that's driving the 540XL motor. This motor is quite a bit bigger than what we see in the other 3S platform cars. That's going to be driving a torque biasing center drive. We'll take a look at that in just a minute and see what they mean by that term. arm. On the other side, we do have the standard Traxxas ID connector and what looks like a pretty generous battery compartment. That's nice to see. Let me grab a standard 4S pack and see if it's going to fit in here. Here we have what I would consider a fairly modestly sized 5800 milliamp hour 4S pack. And it does look like as long as we take this foam out of here, this is going to fit under the standard clamp. And that's really nice to see because a lot of these cars from Traxxas come with battery boxes that aren't really designed to fit anything but the Traxxas batteries. This actually comes with 2 different levels for the clamp. To go along with those 2 different mount positions, we also get an extra clip for the left, meaning that with the 2 different sides of this bracket, you actually get 4 different levels of mounting, which is a lot more versatile than I've seen on some other Traxxas cars. To go along with that bracket, you also get a really comprehensive set of tools, which is nice to see. And then behind that, we get a nice aluminum center brace, which is an upgrade from the plastic one that you get on the BL2S version. And now pulling the rear module off, will give us a closer look at that torque biasing center drive. Pulling that center drive apart, we can see inside, it's just a regular center differential. We've got some pretty thick differential fluid in here, which Traxxas has been putting in most of their bashers. But ultimately, there's nothing special about this. It's just a center diff. It is nice to see a center differential in here, but you're also going to get a center differential with most of this car's competition. And then if we look inside here, you can see we do have a steel pinion gear on the motor. This motor mount does have individual holes for adjustment, but you can remove that little bracket and then it becomes infinitely adjustable. This rear module looks very similar to the front module. The shock tower seems a little bit beefier, but this wing seems way too big for this car, at least to me. I suspect they did this as a cost-cutting measure, not necessarily because it was the most appropriate size wing for this car. Hopefully this thing doesn't get ripped off during bashing. Now, speaking of bashing, I'm gonna get all this put back together because it's time to see what this car can actually do. All right, Traxxas says 60 miles an hour. Let's see what that translates to in real world off-road speed. Full throttle. You turn down the TSM a little bit there. Get another pass. Full throttle. All right, let's get one more pass. Full throttle. All right, let's see what we got. All right, 47 miles an hour. That's not quite gonna get us 60 miles an hour on road though, but it is plenty fast enough for stock bashing, so let's do some of that bashing. Now obviously being a buggy, this thing's gonna be best at high speed maneuvering, but it does seem to handle off-road pretty well. The suspension is reasonably compliant, and yeah, it does seem to jump nicely, and it's handling off-road very, very well. I'm definitely enjoying driving this. It's got enough power to be fun without being so overpowered that it's really difficult to control. Overall, on first impression, it does feel really well tuned and very well adjusted. These tires seem to work pretty well on a variety of surfaces, which is good because it's always annoying to have to replace tires immediately on an RTR vehicle. It's handling this gravel really, really well, and the TSM definitely helps with that. I've got just a little bit of TSM dialed in on it, and it handles pretty well in the grass as well. This is some pretty short grass, and there's quite a bit of looseness to it, but this thing does seem to get a good amount of grip without having too much grip that it wants to traction roll all the time. Definitely does have a good amount of power. It's got a nice punch, enough to do a wheelie, which is good. They've got some pretty thick fluid in the center differential on this, which really makes it feel like a basher. I think that was smart given how this thing's designed. But now let's see how she handles some jumping. This is the Pacific Northwest Madness ramp, and it's a pretty decent ramp. Took a little jump nicely. Let's see if we can get a little bit more speed up this time. All right, here we go. Oh yeah, she jumps. Yeah, decent air control too, especially with these smaller buggy tires. Let's do that again. Get a little bit more speed. Yeah, she jumps really nicely, and it seems to be well dampened for landing as well. Overall, I'm pretty impressed with how this thing's handling. Let's get one more jump, see if maybe we can do a backflip. And yeah, we can do a backflip too. That is awesome. This thing's actually a lot of fun. Let's get a close-up look at that jump. Here she comes. Oh yeah! Now I have to say, out of the box, this definitely feels like one of the better handling RC cars I've had recently.
They definitely did a good job with this car.
So far, guys, as a basher, this thing seems really, really good. It's got a lot of power. The motor and ESC didn't get too hot, and it handles really nicely. Backflips right out of the box for a 1/8 scale buggy is pretty impressive. As far as whether or not this thing has been built as a basher or a racer, though, I would definitely say this thing is built as a basher. It has really thick center differential fluid in it, which means it wheelies really easily. The links and tie rods being plastic instead of adjustable steel definitely points toward a bashing pedigree. And overall, in general, it just feels like a basher, and Traxxas generally makes bashers. There is a really big problem with this being a basher, though. But for now, as I'm sure you're already gathering, we're gonna put these bigger tires on here, and I wanna see how this thing handles off the big ramp. And then, of course, when we come back, we'll talk about my final thoughts. I don't know about you guys, but I think this thing looks absolutely awesome with these bigger tires on it. But the real question is, will these bigger tires make it even more bashable? Let's go find out. In this hobby, there's a quality in cars that's kind of hard to define. You might call it the it factor, but whatever it is, this thing's definitely got it. There's just something about this buggy that makes me want to keep driving it, even after I've already burned through an entire pack and I've gotten my footage. It handles really well, and durability-wise, this is a known quantity. This is the same 3S platform that's been around for a long time. They've made a lot of improvements to it, but not everything is improved. I was actually fairly surprised I didn't break one of these arms, but they will break eventually. Even though these are the upgraded GTR shocks, I did bend a shock shaft, which isn't terribly surprising. I've bent shock shafts on these GTR shocks before. This is definitely a place that could be improved on. When getting on it, especially with these larger tires, the electronics did get pretty hot, so I think a fan or two would definitely be worthwhile. And unfortunately, even with these stock tires, I was getting some hesitation and sort of cogging from a stop when I was getting on it really, really hard. It didn't stop it from being drivable or fun, but it is something to keep in mind. With all that being said, now we need to talk about value, and that's where the Jato 4x4 VXL falls flat on its face. This thing is $530 before tax, and especially being built obviously as a basher, that is a pile of money. That's more expensive than all of the 3S competition, all of the 4S competition, and most of the 6S competition. Now don't get me wrong, this is a really good car. It feels really, really good. It looks awesome. It drives great, but it's still way too expensive. And that unfortunately seems to be the running theme with Traxxas right now. They're building good cars, this is a fantastic basher, but then they're pricing them so high that it makes it nearly impossible to recommend. I would love to be able to recommend this to you, and at $400 or even maybe $450, that would still be more expensive than its closest competition based on the features, but that would be a lot more justifiable. At $530, I just don't know who it's for. If it were set up as a straight racer, then maybe this would be for racers, which would put it in a different category, and that price would be more justifiable, but this is not set up as a racer. This is a basher. Ultimately though, people are gonna buy it, and if you do buy it and you don't mind spending a pile of money on it, you're going to have a lot of fun with this car, with the stock tires, with bigger tires. It's great. And you know what else is great? Watching one of these videos.